So India had interest in Southeast Asia. China was looking west. We had a look east policy. The Chinese had look west. Jagannath Manda spoke about it. Now it's been reframed as the MSR. The US had a pivot to Asia, which essentially meant that attention was now being shifted from the Middle East to Southeast Asia. There's Confluence of the Oceans, which Abe spoke about. So Japan had their own. Indonesia had the nexus. So the argument being made was that nations were looking to opposite theaters for interest and influence, and therefore there was no way that we couldn't see this as one theater. But of course, there was a great deal of pushback from many analysts in India that pointed out that the Pacific and the Indian Ocean are really, in a manner of speaking, as diverse as chalk and cheese. You can't put them together. The Indian Ocean has many areas of non-traditional security. Those were the main concerns. And on the Pacific side, essentially, we were looking at disputes, territorial disputes. The dynamic wasn't similar, and so you sort of couldn't put them together. What I think in the final run, what has held for the concept of maritime Asia is two or three aspects. One is that as an interesting write-up by Dr. Raja Mohan pointed out a few days back, is that nations on both sides were facing similar problems on the non-traditional security front. So the piracy that we saw sometime back of Somalia had now shifted to Southeast Asia. Climate change was clearly an issue on both sides. Issues of overfishing were an issues on both sides. But even otherwise, the area was facing what was called as hybrid threats, which meant threats that involved state assets, but not necessarily the state. Maritime militias that are increasingly playing a role in China's assertive strategy in the in Southeast Asia. The fact that there were insurgencies that were trying to infiltrate into regular maritime forces, as has happened in Pakistan, as you know, about a year back, there was an attack in Karachi on some warships, and the plan was to hijack those warships and launch attacks on Indian and US forces. So these were, in a manner of speaking, hybrid threats. Terrorism was making big inroads, and this was maritime terrorism not at sea, but using the seas to infiltrate onto land and carrying out attacks, as happened in Mumbai. And now there is a suspicion that the attack in Paris that happened some time back may also have had one attacker who found his way from Greece through the seas. So this was again a sort of hybrid threat that conventional forces weren't quite prepared for. So what has been the response of the region? One is that the region has responded, nations by and large, by giving more emphasis on the high seas. So generally speaking, the emphasis earlier of the region used to be on coastal security. That has shifted away, and now there's increasingly within South Asia and Southeast Asia, high seas security is being prioritized. Secondly, and I think more importantly, all nations, maritime nations, seem to have come up with robust maritime strategies. Just in the past about 2 years, we've had a series of maritime strategy releases. The Chinese that came up with a white paper, which was on maritime strategy. The Japanese now are looking at doing away with their pacifist sort of leanings, now trying to do much more on the seas. Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, India, that by the way, just about 2 months back released its own maritime strategy that talks about a robust presence. I wouldn't say a robust presence, but a role to play in the Asia Pacific. So maritime strategies were being changed. And thirdly, and I think importantly, littoral warfare came back. Littoral warfare in maritime studies is that subject which highlights a nation's maritime presence in near coastal waters. So if we look at the Chinese deployment of submarines, the fact that they've been sending amphibious ships to the Indian Ocean region, the Type 54 class destroyers, they all play a role in littoral operations. Similarly, the Japanese, the Russians, and also the kind of ships that India sends now into to Southeast Asia played a greater role in littoral warfare. Finally, what's been India's response to this so far? India had been quite ambivalent about moving away from coastal security since 2008, the Mumbai attacks. That has changed. Just in the past about a few months, we have the broad outlines of a new doctrine, a new doctrine that is looking at bilateral relationships in a way that India can support operations in the far seas and also capacity building in the far seas. So India is now giving a great deal of attention to the Indian Ocean archipelago, our relationships with the Maldives, the Seychelles, with Sri Lanka and other smaller states, and trying to do much more in the far seas. What's happened interestingly, politically, is that while we continue to engage within South Asia and Southeast Asia through the broader framework of there is the IORA on the Indian Ocean side, there is the East Asia Summit on the other side, the ADMM plus. But on operational issues, there are smaller trilaterals being formed. For instance, India has a maritime security trilateral that it does with Maldives and Sri Lanka. We are also looking at forming one such trilateral in the Bay of Bengal. So the movement on the operational front was more to do with these with forming these trilaterals. Do we face challenges? Yes, there is a challenge, and the main challenge for India has been that that we're into an era where the main threats actually come from a break in governance. Maritime governance and different nations holding different positions on issues of maritime governance. The Chinese and the US, for instance, don't agree on what needs to be done in the South China Sea. On matters of maritime principle, I think India has taken a stand. I'll just take half a minute more, sir. I think India's contention is that since there is much more trade that now flows in from Southeast Asia, and the fact that we have interests in Southeast Asia, we're also a growing power that needs to take a stand on issues of maritime principle. We've got to articulate our vision for the region. Finally, I think one of the things that must be pointed out is that there has been a bit of hesitancy on the part of the political structure within India to give a sort of an opening to the Indian Navy to play a greater role at sea, and that has happened essentially because of this. Of the feeling that if an open check is sort of given to the Navy to go out into Southeast Asia, that will lead to greater provocation of China. And therefore, whilst there has been a slight change in our attitude towards maritime security, essentially we still remain, we still follow the old system that we followed in the past, wherein we did a lot in the Indian Ocean region, but we were only a little bit involved in security in Southeast Asia. Thank you.